We just got a 5th film in the God's Not Dead franchise, so it's time to rank them all from my least favorite to my favorite. Welcome Cinema, where we focus on a film. I'm Josh, this is Simply Cinema. Let me know down in the comments below what you thought of the God's Not Dead franchise as a whole, and how you would rank them as individual movies. Do you like it? Do you not like it? Or is it somewhere right in the middle? Make sure to like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe if you haven't already to join in the film culture community where we talk about the love of cinema as a whole. In last place, we have God's Not Dead 2. Now this just feels like the black sheep of the franchise as a whole, because we get this teacher that is involved with this court case. We're getting this lawyer that is trying to defend her that's not quite a lawyer formally yet, and even though their story has a message that does its job in communicating where we're going, certain things that may be happening in real life, or things that have to go about in the way that we're spreading the message of God and Jesus, and certain things about that work, but it also feels like the movie that's trying to be a setup to God's Not Dead 3 with what we're doing with Pastor David Hill. And so how that all flows on throughout, while the first one is multiple different characters that flows on together throughout in a great divide of how they're pacing the movie as a whole, this one just loses some of the momentum when you're getting less different perspectives, but they're less characters that are connected to each other, and we get one of the characters, Amy, that's a return from the first movie, and it contradicts the consequence of what was so heavy about the first film, and so getting her back just doesn't do much favor to where we're headed with her character, and she's not seen again for the rest of the franchise, and the flow of the natural ideas just doesn't necessarily feel proper or right. And while we get multiple different subplots, it just makes and overcrowds the movie in a way that shouldn't, for having less characters, because we care less about where we're headed in the future, for where we're building up some of these side characters that are leading up to become main characters, because we're building up so much with the future of this franchise that probably wasn't planned to begin with. Well, there's also an idea with what we're getting out of the main storyline with the teacher, how we're involving that we get less of them, so there's less to care about those characters, even though they're meant to be the main focus. And so, well, it just waters down that main story and loses the ideas, the tension that really drives home the force, and also goes about making you believe certain characters or certain things are meant to be a certain way by their appearance, and people aren't as they appear, which is sort of a sour note for where it tries to mislead you. So even its twists as a whole just don't feel right by their own earnings. And at number 4, we have God's Not Dead and God's We Trust. Now this is a bit better of a film for how it's going about. The court drama isn't necessarily as heavy-handed for what it takes on with its debate. There's certain storylines that feel like it hones in on a message particularly better, even though some of it is fuzzy on how realistic or appealing it is to the ideas. I'm not a huge political film person, and so this sort of bleeds into the lines of whether it's communicating too much or communicating too little based on what I know about politics, the characters, something that I wouldn't necessarily put on for entertainment, as this movie kind of is leading into, while also being informative, of a lesson of trying to get Christians to vote. But that message doesn't feel like it fills out the runtime of this filler, and there's also one particular character that feels like a distraction because they're putting the main focus, what David Hill is trying to solve within this predicament, within the becoming in the Congress, that kind of distracts from the story because they're putting a representative woman as a character as part of what represents this big problem, but it only appears like a few different times throughout the film, and so it retracts and has to remind you of what's going on, but it doesn't do a good job with the flow, with the pacing, even though there's some good things about the camera work, how it flows on throughout. There's certain matters that just doesn't win me over by the end. And at number 3, we have God's Not Dead. Now this one, I'm a lot more appealed to this just because it's the one that really worked for me when it was back then, when I was younger, and still being able to understand it now. I see a lot more where the message is, where the heart of the story is, and it's unique in telling all these different perspectives, bleeding them all together, and being able to manage to divide up the lines where we're going from one perspective to another and another, but then also being able to break up the segments of the film so you don't necessarily forget where the character was within the last scene that they shown of them. And so that's just a nice mannered way of how they're telling this message, being able to handle it in a great way. And there's still retractions, still unfortunately, to with so many characters, you get less time to spend digging into their depth and their personalities. And so there's very flat characters with what you're getting, certain things that don't necessarily feel contrived, but it flows about and you don't necessarily get to learn and care and love about multiple different stories because you're getting less of them. You don't necessarily get to know them to begin with, where they're headed with their arc, and they don't even have time for character arcs except for maybe a couple, because of the fact that we're dividing the time between multiple characters. So while it's a cool concept, it does lose some ideas with where it's setting up its characters. Which leads me into number 2, God's Not Dead, Light in the Darkness. Now this has its good momentum. It has dramatic moments that hold consequences and show at least a lot more believability and momentum to what they're doing with Christians that have flaws. I love what they're doing with the Pastor David and just having parts of anger issues and things that he has to really resolve in deep trauma, certain things where he has to connect with his brothers and bringing characters in that question their faith. It still doesn't do too much with how it's digging into those characters because there's a few too many plot lines here and there, even if it's more centered on certain characters. What it's doing with the questions, what it's trying to resolve, brings you into too many circles that can distract from the flow of the story. But still, ultimately, at the end of the day, I still feel like this is one of the better ones for where it goes about with its story, with its drama, and ultimately the higher tension with the flow of the ideas and its message as a whole. Which leads me into number 1. We got God's Not Dead, We the People. Now this still isn't a grand film. I'm not particularly loving what we get out of this franchise, how it touches on conservative Christians and doesn't take too many high risks as a whole. But this one, it's a little bit more heavy-handed with where it's going, the higher tension, certain ideas, and the directing from Vance Knoll just being a great view on the camera flow, making the action feel more quick and high-tempered, and informing the audience of things that are important to the story by feeding you facts that are also informative to the natural ideas of its history that are important to the themes of where it is leading on with its narrative, that doesn't feel too forced, too educational even within this film. And so the pacing of where it's going about, there are certain surprises along the way, what it's doing with its characters that feel naturally earned with the twists that are led into the reveals of ideas, and characters that show they're not always connected to each other. They're not always perfect Christians that are leading and teaching and doing everything that shows a true community that isn't always perfect with getting to know everyone. And so that just builds upon the reality of certain situations, certain churches. We still don't get too much of the idea of the church being one as the people, but it still goes about, touches on the specific idea of homeschooling getting somewhat attacked, or certain controls and rise to power with where we're getting that. We get a great villain with what we're doing with Peter and the ideas, what we're doing in the main court scene. And so that just builds on some elevation to the story. Now the story doesn't do super good job opening the scene where we get the main God's Not Dead theme song. That sort of doesn't go with the pacing at the opening scene, and at the end it sort of brushes over some of the resolution to the story with all of its multiple subplots. But ultimately, it still manages to craft something that tells its story and theme with a message that feels potent and well earned for how it builds upon its characters throughout, making it my #1 film of the God's Not Dead franchise. So that's just my review and ranking of the God's Not Dead franchise. Let me know down in the comments below how you would rank the God's Not franchise, and how you think of the franchise as a complete package. Make sure to like this video if you enjoy it, subscribe if you haven't already, to join in this film culture community where we talk about the love of cinema as a whole. So that's just all, and make sure to do yourself a favor and go watch a movie.